welcome everybody to UCLA and to the Anderson School of Management and to the Anderson Forecast, which we're doing today in collaboration with the UCLA Simon Center for Real Estate. I'd like you to please excuse our parking situation and our construction. We have a new and what we believe will be spectacular addition to our business school, which is under construction right behind this building. So I am sorry about the inconvenience, but in future years we might be so lucky as to meet there. So let's see, we have two panelists. Hopefully a few others will arrive. Let me start with a word or two about this panel, and then I'm going to call up David Schulman to make some formal remarks, and then we will take it from, we will sort of leverage off of his formal remarks as we try to get to some housing solutions for California. But the panel, as you know, is called Zoning Regulations. How do we tell the difference between the good, the bad, and the ugly? And I would just like to say the following. If you opened a real estate textbook in the 1960s or the 1970s and you looked up zoning, they would talk to you about the separation of what would be described as incompatible land uses. In other words, a polluting factory that would be put next to an elementary school. And indeed, that was the textbook purpose of zoning. Now, since that time, if you went to graduate school in planning or economics or something like that, and you really started to study zoning, you would find that there would be all sorts of academic work that's been done on the topic, and the academic work comes under the heading of what could be described as exclusionary zoning or fiscal zoning. In other words, the powers of the local government to determine land use based on exclusionary or fiscal motivations. Now, the exclusionary is pretty clear. If you went to Pasadena in the 1950s, there was ordinance that kept African Americans out of Pasadena after nightfall. And there was explicit racial context to zoning, just as there would be an economic motivation for zoning. For example, the motivation to keep poor people or homeless people or other such groups out of our community. And indeed, it'd be pretty easy to do that if you were a suburban locality and it was the 1960s and people were pouring out of central cities to the suburbs, and you made sure that your lots were zoned exclusively to large single-family homes. That would determine if you could get away with it, the economic character of your community. That would be an example also of exclusionary and also of fiscal zoning. Now, fiscal zoning came around in the state of California at about the time that we enacted Proposition 13 in 1978. What Prop 13 did, for those of you who voted on this or even recall it, was it basically reduced by statute the local property tax rate to 1% of market value of the property. And that was basically, on average for the state of California, a halving. 1/2 of property tax revenues were then destined to local government, where the property tax was the primary revenue tool of local government. So local government all up and down the state overnight found itself fiscally underwater, in the sense that local government had schools, maintenance, services, roads, sewers, whatever, all locally funded activity, and all of a sudden the revenue stream was halved. And how did local government react to Prop 13? They reacted to Proposition 13 overwhelmingly by engaging in fiscal zoning. In other words, in zoning out, as they had the power to do this, land uses that provided revenues that were inadequate relative to their cost structure. So again, if we're talking about low-income housing, if we're talking about housing that was associated with higher rates of utilization of police or fire or other city services, where these were costly endeavors on the part of local government, those uses would be zoned away. Now, how do I know that? Well, one reason I know it is this was actually the topic of my PhD dissertation at Berkeley in 1978, where I did a survey of all local government in the San Francisco Bay Area. And by way of conversations that I had with mayors throughout the Bay Area during one summer, this was the result of our work, and we looked at it statistically and every other way. But anyway, the bottom line is we've evolved from what I'd call plain vanilla zoning to exclusionary zoning to fiscal zoning, and this was then followed in the mid-1970s by a case that was decided in the US Supreme Court that was known as the Petaluma decision. And in that decision, the US Supreme Court upheld the right of local government, in this case, the city of Petaluma in the Bay Area, to manage growth. In other words, to zone land for purposes of what I'd call exclusionary fiscal growth management. So that came down, and it came down as a Supreme Court decision. It set precedent for everything that came after it. So draw a line from Proposition 13, from the Petaluma decision in the US Supreme Court to today. And what we have today, and I'm going to stop talking because we have a whole panel on presentation, is what some social scientists call the tragedy of the commons. Now, what's the tragedy of the commons? Everybody knows we need more housing, and everybody knows we need more affordable housing. And everybody knows that the way to move ourselves out of this egregious situation is to build, to create housing supply. But that's not the interest of a specific local government. So the tragedy of the commons is that every local government has an interest which is in some ways contrary to the global common interest here. And of course, there are consequences to that. And I'm going to get to those consequences momentarily, and I'm going to get to those consequences with the panel. With that, we'll ask David to come up and say something about affordable housing.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. It's going to be more about housing in general, and we'll get to affordable housing on the panel. And my theme is for housing is we're in the best of times and the worst of times for housing. And it really depends where you sit and where you live. The housing market right now, if you're owner, spectacular, especially in California. It's absolutely terrific. It's never been better, especially in West Los Angeles, within 5 miles of here. It's horrible for renters. It's horrible for potential buyers, especially in strong job market and zoning constrained MSAs. So it depends where you live and where you sit. There's also a huge price dichotomy among MSAs, where some MSAs are very expensive and others are very affordable. And we're not going to get into Jerry's trash talk on Houston and Toledo, because they are really pretty nice places on that. And the other thing is the post-2010 housing recovery has really lagged history big time. So something really different has changed. Maybe we're in a new normal for housing construction. And the other thing going on is, despite overbuilding, we talked about the Alan Matkins survey, despite overbuilding, at the high end, multifamily rental construction continues to boom because they're looking through the current rise in vacancy rates and continuing to build multifamily housing. Okay, this is the best of times. So if you live in one of these houses, everything is great, because your house is going up. There's a ticker tape running along your screen in the living room. The ticker tape is moving, tick, 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 and every 10 minutes you check the tape and your house is up $500, $1,000, and every 10 minutes or 20 minutes it sort of builds up to a pretty big, it's a pretty good day. But it's the worst of times if you're looking, and this is sort of Seattle, not Los Angeles. There's not a lot of square footage, but it's in your price range, and the little doghouse here is for sale at $250,000 $250,000, because that's a cartoon out of the Seattle Times on that. And Little Muffy is happy, but they're going to evict Little Muffy there in the doghouse. And then also, if you're renting, and this is a little box, if you want a little box to live, it's $2,000 a month to rent this little box. So if you're a renter, both of these sort of on the extreme side. And for those people, if you're a prospective home buyer or you're a renter, this is sort of the worst of times for housing. So it depends where you live and where you sit. And here's the interesting thing is this is the housing cycle since 1959. Average 1,435,000, 1959 to 2017, 1,435,000. We had several periods over 2 million, approaching 2 million. This cycle, we don't think we're going to get to the long-term average of 1,435. So something is going on that's really different. Also, if you notice, is the housing crash of 2008 to 2011 was the worst housing crash of the post-war era. And normally when you go down hard, you sort of pick up, you grow much back, but we haven't gotten anywhere near the long-term average. And we think for a whole bunch of factors, it's going to roll over at the end of 2020, and we're not going to even get to the long-term average. So people say there's a shortage of housing. You could argue there was a surplus between 05 and 08, 06 and 08, because we overbuilt. But this has been a very, very, very long period of underbuilding. All right, next thing is this is the National Case-Shiller Index. In real terms, it's not a new high, but we've surpassed the old peak of 2007, of the 2006 of the bubble years. We're now, housing prices have exceeded in California. And Jerry showed a slide, and the same thing is true in the major metro areas of California. All right, now, but the thing is, it's different among cities. From 2000 to 2018 Q1, LA is up 178%. Seattle 138, Denver 111. But look at Chicago. Chicago's only up 40% in 18 years. It's like nothing. It's less than inflation. So real house prices have declined. And you could say all kinds of issues about Chicago, but Atlanta's a growing Sun Belt city, booming job market, everything. Atlanta's only up 42%. So something is going on. Atlanta's easy to build. Also Chicago, compared to the Los Angeles area, Chicago is also an easy place to build. While Los Angeles, Seattle, and now Denver, lately, Denver's becoming more difficult to build. But if you go to Denver, you see cranes everywhere. So it isn't clear how difficult it is. But so that's what's going on around the country. And we're not going to talk, not necessarily thinking of Houston or Toledo, but Atlanta's a successful city. Chicago, some parts successful, some part very unsuccessful in Chicago. But Chicago home prices really haven't gone up all that much. All right. The other thing is people are staying put. We're not trading houses. So this is just existing home sales. We peaked at 7 million in 2005. We're not going to hit 6 million in this cycle, and people are sort of staying put and not moving around. There's a whole bunch of reasons for that. There's a whole bunch of reasons. And people aren't moving to the Sun Belt as much, and people are tending to basically live in the house that they been living in for the past 20 or 30 years and not moving around. And that creates a whole blockage for any new potential buyer because you don't have an existing homeowner selling to move someplace else. The other thing is people aren't moving geographically. Mobility has sort of been blocked, and I think that's a hangover from the great financial crisis where people have become risk averse, so it's hard to pick up and move someplace. And the other thing is also especially hard if you're coming from a low-cost area where the job outlook may not be great to go to a place where the job outlook is strong. It's really hard to move to LA if you're coming from Chicago or you're coming from Atlanta because your housing costs are going to double and you're going to or triple, and you're going to need to make a lot more money to make the move, so people are reluctant to make the move. The next thing is homeowners are staying put, so what they do is they remodel. So if you want to take a look at one of the best stocks in the New York Stock Exchange in the past 10 years has been Home Depot. And this chart is if you're going to stay in your house, you're going to remodel. And this especially is I know a lot of people, their aspiration was 10, 20 years ago is they really wanted to live in $1 million house. So they've discovered all of a sudden the house they've been living in for the past 20 years is now $1 million house. So they're now doing that. They've fulfilled their aspiration. So since they're living in $1 million house, it can't look as junky and crappy as when the house was only a $200,000 house. So they got to fix it up And so it pays to remodel because you'll get the value out of the remodeling. So you have kitchens, bathrooms, home additions, and what have you. So that's been, and that's been booming, as you can see there, for the past decade. The other thing is, I talked about it before, employment growth is strong, so that underpins demand. I talked about wage growth. I talked about that before. That underpins demand. And the other thing is household formations. You know, they drop. These numbers bounce around, but it looks like there's underlying, from point of view of household demand, it looks like there's 1.2 million. Sort of looks like underlying demand. But you know, housing gets demolished. There's all kinds of other things that happened, but we look like there's underlying demand in terms of household for about 1,200,000 units, and that doesn't count second homes, and doesn't count. You know, there's also some of that is fulfilled by mobile homes or factory-built housing, but we had this inexplicable decline in 16 and 17 for new household formation. My guess that'll get revised in the data when we get the census in 2020 and they redo these numbers. Now, the other thing is we've been living in an unprecedented low mortgage rate environment until very, very recently, and mortgages were below 4%. Now, normally, if you would have said to people back in 2005, 2004, 30-year fixed mortgages at 4%, you're supposed to get a boom. I mean, that's been the history. I mean, we had a boom in California with 9% mortgages in the late 80s. So you're supposed to get a boom with 4% mortgages. So we haven't gotten the boom with 4% mortgages. What's going to be like when mortgages are 5.5%? You know, mortgage rates, 30-year fixed, are probably 4.5 to 4 3/4, 4 3/8 to 4 3/4, you know, depending on what bank and how they do it. In mortgage rates, if we're right on our forecast of the 10-year Treasury going to 4, mortgage rates are going to go into the 5s a year from now. So that's part of the reason why we're not going to, even with everything, backdrop good is the mortgage rate situation is going to turn hostile. And the other thing going on is we got a lot of non-prime loans. You can't call them subprime because that was the last crisis, so the banks call it non-prime. And these non-prime loans is they will allow total debt services, mortgages, student loans, credit card debt, car debt. They'll allow fixed cost 45% of income. And people are putting down 45%, that isn't only just mortgage, but it's all fixed cost, 45% of income. They're making loans on that. And there's 3 to 5% down payment loans. And the other thing going on is they're now making loans on the West LA here and also in Silicon Valley against stock options, and they're counting stock options as income. So if there is a bubble in the market, if you really want to worry about house prices, look at the NASDAQ. The NASDAQ has made a new high today. The NASDAQ gets a 20% correction and stays down. You're going to have a lot of folks underwater in houses in West LA, Venice, Santa Monica, Cupertino, San Jose, you know, the Bay Area, high, expensive condominiums in the city of San Francisco, because these things are being funded with stock option money. And if the NASDAQ drops, if you have meaningful correction in the NASDAQ, that will ripple its way through the housing market, and that'll be pretty quickly, because if that stock option income goes away and you have high student loans, you have high mortgage and what have you, all of a sudden you're going to have a real problem in the market. And that could happen next week, it could happen 6 months from now, it could happen 3 years from now. But that's sort of a risk that's sort of hanging out there for housing prices, which are fed by the technology boom. Okay. Now, it's exacerbated. Also, this whole issue is exacerbated in expensive markets. I just threw out for LA, for median home price in LA, $580,000. Median income, $58,000. Most people in this room are families are well above $58,000, but the median income in LA County is $58,000. The median house price is $580,000, and most of that is east, not west, obviously. But that's 10 times income. Numbers don't work. So that's the unaffordability, and this gets worse because house prices are going up faster than income. And the other thing is we have potential borrowers. This is student loan debt. It's gone from about $500 billion to $1.5 trillion, has tripled since 2006. And this isn't only young people, there's older people with student loan debt. So that sort of is a burden on any kind of potential new home buyer, is they got to pay off that, they have to pay off that student loan debt, and that cuts into affordability. Okay. Then the other thing, which is a weak factor for demand, is I call this sort of bedroom economics here, is the birth rate. The birth rate's at the lowest since 1920, right now in the United States. Now you could say, is that limiting demand, or is that a result of high home prices? So this could be two-way. You could have two-way causality, but delays in major lifestyle events also is sort of slowing down new construction, slowing down moving around. And part of the reason why the single-family housing market isn't as strong as it is without any kids, you could live in a 900 square foot apartment. You throw two screaming kids in a 900 square foot apartment, and you got a very, very serious problem. So you either need a 2,500 foot apartment, or you got to buy a single-family home 50 or 60 miles away from where your job is. So that's part of the issue. Okay, and then we have negative supply fundamentals. We'll talk about the zoning here on the panel. We talked about there's a question of rising construction labor. That's there. And we also have rising lumber costs. And this is the price of lumber. The price of lumber here has gone up from like $400 to $600 per 1,000 board feet. And this big increase, when you see this increase where it starts to take off, that was when the President of the United States, the Tariff Commission, instituted 20% tariffs, 22% tariffs on Canadian softwood lumber. So this is one of the implications of the tariffs. You could knock probably 20% off this lumber price if they did away with the tariff, but that all goes into construction costs. So you have impact. You know, when you say tariff, just remember, you got to just remember, a tariff is a tax. A tariff is a tax. Repeat after me, and that's one of the issues. And if you put it on steel, that's automatically going to go to the high-rise construction, because you have all the steel bars, the rebar, and all that. That's going to go right into. It's going to raise the cost of high-rise construction, starting in. Well, steel prices have already moved up in response to the tariff. So that's going to exacerbate the issue in terms of the building cost issues. But the real issue in California isn't so much hard cost, it's land and permitting. Okay. Now the other thing is we're going to see a sort of a home ownership is beginning to rise after a very long decline. We had a big bubble in home ownership in the late 2003, 4, 5, and 6. Where basically if you could fog a mirror, you could get a mortgage loan. And so we had people in houses who shouldn't have been in ownership houses. They're now out of ownership houses. The home ownership rate went from 69% down to almost to 63%. It's probably going to creep back to 65, 66% is sort of our guess over time, as ultimately these screaming kids will force people into ownership situations. Okay. The other thing going on is multifamily looks a lot different from the single-family chart. Multifamily has been a boom. We've been approaching 400,000 units a year. We'll get that in 18 and 19, and that's going to continue. Single-family is expensive. People go to multifamily, whether it's apartments or condominiums. There's a preference for an more urban lifestyle, so you get demand for multifamily housing as well. And the thing is vacancy rates collapsed, and that's part of the reason why we're building, but the vacancy is now rising at the high end. But in the Matkin service, the builders are going to keep building anyway, even though vacancy is rising, because they're going to look through the vacancy. They're going to look, because rents are falling in the high end of the market in many places, parts of San Francisco, parts of Los Angeles. High-end rents are falling because that's the only place where developers can build. So we're beginning to see a rise in the vacancy rate. That's probably going to go to 5%. That's national. That's probably going to go higher. But builders will continue to build into the vacancy in the hope that the market will clear in 2020, 2021, 2022 when they'll make their return. And the other reason is a lot of real estate investors are afraid of investing in retail because of all online shopping. So the money, instead of going into retail construction, is going into apartment construction. So apartments will continue at the high end, will continue to boom. Now the thing is, some developers would like to build to the middle of the market. The market can't build for the low end of the market. It's never been able to build to the low end of the market. They would like to build for the middle market, but land costs, construction costs, permitting, and what have you makes it impossible to build for the middle of the market unless you're in a suburban fringe area. Okay. And rents have been going up. This is the CPI. Los Angeles is much faster than this. Rents have been rising for the past 3 or 4 years at 3.5% annual rates. It's beginning to roll over a little bit. Now, this is rents in place. So therefore, rent control tends to suppress this number where there's rent control. This isn't market rent. This is a lot of cities are in the sample, but a lot of those cities have rent control. But that's been the average increase in rents nationwide. But if you look at this thing is, since 2010, rents are up nationally 27%. Employee compensation is up 19%. So rents are growing 50% faster than employee comp. Overall CPI is up 15%, so rents are double. And in Los Angeles, the situation is worse, but rents are double what CPI is. That's one of the driving forces of CPI. And it's up 50% more than wages. So if you started off, you had a squeezed renter population in 2010, they're more squeezed today on a national basis. Let me go back one. Okay, so to conclude, if you're an owner in West LA, it's never been better. If you want to buy something in West LA or you're renting somewhere in Los Angeles, it's horrible. It's probably the worst it's been. House prices have recovered since 2007, 2011. Part of it is easier lending standards. We're in a modest recovery in construction. Rent increases are going to continue to exceed wage growth and CPI. And the multifamily will continue to boom. So we could go to the panel. Thank you.
Okay, well, David, thank you for that excellent backdrop to our panel discussion. Let me at this moment just provide a few additional words of backdrop, and then we're going to turn to the panel for a fulsome discussion of all this. A couple of motivating factoids. A full 1/2 of all rental households in the United States are what we call rent burdened, meaning that they spend over 30% of their income on rent. Many of them spend more than 50% of their income on rent. 1/3 of the rent burdened households in the United States are families with children. As Jerry showed earlier, there's a correlation between affordability and amenities. And what that means in most metropolitan areas is that the affordable housing is in areas of low rents, meaning in areas of low amenities. What am I saying? What I'm saying is that those families with children live in areas where crime is high, schools are poor, and air quality is poor. And if you want some graphic evidence of that, just drive the freeways of LA and take a look at the densification of development within feet of the most polluted roads in the world. And if you look to the epidemiological literature, it'll tell you that children that live within 10 feet of freeways suffer from much higher incidence of respiratory disease, cancer, and other such things. So real consequences for families in terms of schools, crime, health, etc. How do families deal with low affordability in these high-cost metro areas? Well, they commute from further away. And the commute costs aren't just theirs, they're all of ours in the form of more congested metropolitan areas. It's number one. Number two, they double up and triple up. And that, of course, is another version of density. And number three, as David and Jerry and others have been alluding to, there's nothing sacred about the economic viability of the Bay Area or of LA or of New York City or any of these other housing cost areas. And that comes to a concept that we know very well in economics, which is called spatial arbitrage of residences and employment. We sometimes call it spatial equilibration. In other words, rather than just look at San Francisco in isolation, look at San Francisco in terms of what we call a system of cities. And what that means is that Silicon Valley has come to Silicon Beach, and it's come to Austin and Boulder and Portland and Seattle and a myriad of other places. And the economic pressures related to housing affordability will only continue to reinforce those trends. What it means is that Goldman Sachs has put its entire back office workforce to Salt Lake City from New York City, and all of those trends continue. So if we talk here about affordable housing and the importance of affordable housing, it's not just an ethical consideration or a concern about distribution in our society, it's also about the economic viability of the Bay Area and the economic viability of any other housing cost area. If you were in LA in 1970, you knew that there was a lot of heavy manufacturing in this metro area, and you know that all of that's gone. And anyway, so with that, I'll leave you with one point which I think is worthy of consideration, and then we're going to go to our panel. The point is as follows. If you're a profit-maximizing developer, how do you build affordable housing on land that's as expensive as the land in LA or the Bay Area? And if the answer is you don't, the question is how do we, in a salient way, not in a symbolic way, we can use all kinds of methodology to create that symbolic affordable building in Santa Monica. But that, if you will, is a teacup of water into the Santa Monica Bay.
Right.
That's not solving a problem. So the question is saliency. How do we create the numbers of affordable units that will allow these metro areas to continue to be economically viable and to thrive, not to mention the ethical considerations. So with that, I would like to introduce the panel. I'll go from my left. You know the distinguished David Schulman, needing no further introduction. To his left, Suzanne Fuentes, the former mayor of the, Suzanne Fuentes over there, former mayor of the city of El Segundo. To David's left, Cynthia Strathman, the executive director of strategic actions for a just economy. Let's see, to Cynthia's left, Mike Lenz, my colleague here at UCLA, a professor in the School of Planning and Policy. And to Mike's left, a member of the new generation of leadership in the California State Legislature, Scott Wiener, who's here representing San Francisco up in Sacramento. And the way I'd like to play this out, actually, and I haven't received permission from the panel to do this, is to begin with Scott and to use some of Scott's proposals and some of his thinking as kind of the protagonist to the conversation that we're going to have. Now, Scott, if you know, Scott has introduced some what I call spectacular legislation, which seeks, among other things, to densify development along major transportation hubs. This, relative to what I was saying earlier, is controversial among a number of different lines, inclusive of the question of states' rights versus local rights, and who's going to determine what development goes where. And Scott, if you will, this can be hard, and especially for someone like me, maybe not for you. But just in a nutshell, if you could tell the audience, number one, what's the kernel of your thinking? Number two, if you could say how it's been greeted politically and how you are adjusting to push it further.
Sure. So thank you for having me today, and I'm either the protagonist or the antagonist, depending on where you sit. And I think the reference was to Senate Bill 827, our bill to allow more housing near public transportation. See, that's democracy in action, so people can have their opinions. Basically, the thinking underlying the bill is the following. The estimate is that California has a housing deficit, a shortage of about 3.5 million homes. That's how many homes we are short of what we need. That deficit of 3.5 million homes in California is equal to the other 49 states combined. It's about a 7.5 million home deficit nationally. About half of that is here in California. So even though our housing problems are not unique in California, we're seeing them excuse me, in more and more parts of the country. We are the tip of the spear in a not so great way. And so when you think about how do we over time, and we, excuse me, how do we close that deficit? And so our two leading Democrats for governor, Gavin Newsom and Antonio Villaraigosa, both promised, in my tenure, we're going to build 3.5 million homes. And God bless them. That's more per year than we built even at the height. But I think it's good to think big. But the question is, how do we do that, and where do those homes go? And what we have at times done in California is said, okay, we don't want to build where there's already people, so just keep sprawling further and further out. And that's not sustainable. It's not sustainable from a climate perspective. It's not sustainable from an economic perspective. It's not sustainable in terms of having people who are commuting 2 hours each way to work, which creates congestion. It means that you're getting home to your kids at 9 o'clock at night. It's not good for your family. It means you're probably getting back problems and maybe diabetes. It's so bad for so many different reasons. And so we need to be strategic in saying that housing needs to be near where people work and accessible to public transportation. And that's where it gets hard, because when you look in the urbanized parts of LA or the Bay Area, it's hard. And what we've traditionally done is said, we're going to put all the dense housing only in a few areas, typically where low-income people live, and everywhere else is going to be hyper-low density. We see it in LA, where the density tends to go. We see it in San Francisco, in my city, where 72% of the land is zoned for either single family or 2 units. Mm-hmm. And then we have our lower income neighborhoods that are zoned high density. And so the bill would provide that within certain distances of types of public transportation, with high frequency, et cetera, robust public transportation, local communities could not impose hyper low density housing. We're past the point where you can have a BART station or subway station, whatever, major transit infrastructure where apartment buildings are banned. That's what it really is. When you have a city that says, we have, let's say, a BART station in the Bay Area, LA Metro Station, and the city says you can only build single-family homes or only 2-unit. It's a ban on even small apartment buildings, and we want to unban them. We used to build them before we downzoned in LA and San Francisco and elsewhere. They used to be allowed, and that's a lot of our rent-controlled housing stock in San Francisco are these small 3, 4, 5-story apartment buildings that were then banned. You can't build them anymore. And I want to just also say, I'm a believer, people sometimes say, oh, do you want market rate housing or do you want affordable housing? And by affordable housing, I think a lot of us refer to housing that is income-based, so people are paying no more than 30% of their income, typically for lower income, working class people. What do you want? The answer is all of the above. We have this massive deficit overall, but I agree with the statement that was made before that the market is not going to produce on its own housing affordable to low income people. And so that requires subsidies from the government. It requires inclusionary housing, which I support. But it's important to remember when a parcel of land is zoned for single family home or for 2 units, there will never be affordable housing on that site. And that is because if you are a developer of low income housing, affordable housing, you're not going to build a single family home that's going to be deed restricted for low. You need multi-unit. Affordable housing developers need multi-unit. If you are wanting inclusionary housing, so we have mixed income developments, a parcel zone for single family, you'll never get inclusionary on there because it's not big enough and it's not. So having multi-unit means we will get market rate, but it also means that we will take parcels that are ineligible for affordable housing will now become eligible for affordable housing, both as 100% affordable projects and mixed income inclusionary projects. And so we're trying to open up some of these communities that are exclusionary, that are keeping people out, and allow more people of more income levels to be able to live in these communities and access transit. I don't think it's okay for a community to say, you know what, we're a wealthy community, only single family here, we get to have our own private BART station. That's what, you know, and we get to walk there, and for the person who's working at the Starbucks or taking care of our kids, that person can commute an hour and a half to get into our community, and they can't use BART. That's what this is about, and that's what we're trying to break open, and it's a hard conversation. We have traditionally, unlike education or healthcare anywhere else, we have told local communities, you can do whatever you want. We're not going to tell you what to do. We would never tolerate that with our public education system, yet we've done that here. And we're rebalancing the state versus local role. I'm a former local elected official. Local control is important, but it's not biblical. Local control is important and it's good when it delivers good results. On housing, it is not delivering good results.
Great. Okay. So by the way, we're going to open this up and take a bunch of questions, but we're going to, I'd like to get all of our panelists into the conversation prior to doing that. So harking back to this idea of tragedy of the commons, you've heard one solution in the case of affordable housing to this tragedy of the commons, and the solution has to do with the rebalancing of state versus local control, and this is what's embodied in Scott's bill. Okay, now let's turn to Cynthia and to Suzanne, and both, each in their own way, representatives of different communities here in LA, different geographies here in LA, and communities that are being buffeted by different economic pressures, including pressures of gentrification, pressures of Silicon Beach, and the like. And in no particular order, Suzanne and Cynthia, you choose.
Go ahead, Cynthia.
I'd love for the two of you to do two things.
Okay.
To react to Scott, to tell him where he's right and where he's wrong, and how you would adjust. And secondarily, for each of you to address the tragedy of the commons. How would you solve that particular issue? In other words, this common need for substantially increased development of affordable housing, if indeed LA and San Francisco are going to continue to be as viable as we've been recently as major world-class cities.
Okay. You want me to go? Okay. Well, so I work at Strategic Actions for a Just Economy. We're a nonprofit in South Central Los Angeles, historic South Central. And as most of you know, that's a very low-income area. It's not accidental. It was redlined historically. It has been predominantly African American and now a lot of very low-income Latino immigrants. My organization works to support tenant rights and equitable development. We have a tenant clinic so that we see a lot of people coming in all the time who are having very severe problems with their housing. And the folks who live near us, I mean, their household incomes are around $20,000 a year. A lot of them work in the garment industry, so their average wages are around $350 an hour because they're doing piecework. There's a lot of wage theft. Many of them don't have recourse to a lot of official remedies for a variety of reasons. They're often living in very overcrowded conditions. So I know you mentioned you eventually have to move into, but you can't if you can't, right? So there's folks there, you know, we work in one building that has like 20 units and they're all singles and they're all families. And so this is clearly not a sustainable thing. Like people can get by having their 2 kids and their brother in a single for a while, but eventually when those kids grow up and have families of their own, it just really becomes even more insurmountable. So we are seeing for our constituency a real need for more housing. And I think in that sense, we're completely on board with Senator Wiener. And we also helped found the Alliance for Community Transit, which has really supported high density build-outs along transit corridors as a way to solve some environmental problems by keeping a lot of those really transit-dependent families along transit corridors, and also provide housing for these people who really desperately need it. They cannot just stay in their own unit, even if it's rent stabilized. Like, that's not going to be a long-term solution for them. I think where we departed ways on the SB 827 issue wasn't so much in the goals, was in the way that methodology was rolling out, where we felt it needed a little bit more nuance in terms of keeping some provisions in there to make sure that there was inclusionary affordable housing, that there were protections for existing tenants, and we have worked on these kinds of solutions in the past in Los Angeles. Alliance for Community Transit was really instrumental in helping pass Measure JJJ, which is an inclusionary, functionally, and it's kind of like an inclusionary zoning policy along transit lines, and also had some good job components, and also the community plans for South and Southeast LA. As you guys know, the community plans are being rewritten for the city, and that covers around 550,000 people, has some density and job requirements there that line up with JJJ. So these are ways to increase density while also having inclusionary provisions for new affordable housing build-outs. And then we're also always pushing for tenant protections, because in addition to not wanting to build more affordable housing, we also have to make sure people aren't getting turfed out of the affordable housing they already have. You know, there's like a big resegregation happening in Los Angeles that's even more severe and deep than I think the ones we had before, where lower income people of color are being pushed out to Lancaster and Victorville. And you know, there's one building we're working in where the manager just said, look, want to flesh out all the Mexicans so that we can move in higher income people. So this stuff is being very blatant, and it's happening all the time. So we have to have those tenant protections in there. That's really important too. And so we're very supportive of these efforts to increase density. We just want to see some of the other things get rolled into that package. And I think hopefully this will work out.
Thank you for including me. I'm curious what the sign said that was held up.
It says that Scott Wiener is bought out by developers.
Oh,
There we go.
Okay. So I represent a small town of 16,700 by night and about 60,000 during the day. El Segundo is an employment center. I am a 7th generation Angelino on one side, and on the other side, 2nd generation. My grandmother came from Mexico. And I fully believe in local control. El Segundo, our residential area, is pretty much built out. We don't have any place else to put additional parks. Our infrastructure was built for basically R1, and we do have a lot of multifamily. But when increasing that is forced on us, we don't really have anywhere to go. And another interesting thing that hasn't been brought up about property taxes is El Segundo gets 6.4 cents on the dollar returned. We're about the lowest in the county. Our neighbor just to the south, Manhattan Beach, gets 14 cents on every dollar, and the city of Los Angeles gets 27 cents. So if we're going to have this unfunded mandate basically to stuff more people in our town, we have less money to provide services with. So local control is very important. You know, we have strategic plans, we have planning commissions. Our town has been built out, and now that's being turned upside down on us, where there is no such thing as R1 in California anymore, because every piece of property can basically have an auxiliary dwelling unit up to 1,200 square feet. That was bigger than my first house. You know, that's pretty sizable. So things are being forced on us that's very hard to a city to react to. We do have transit, but it's all east of Pacific Coast Highway, so it doesn't come to our residential. The metro stops go to the employment center to bring people in and out of town to their homes.
Okay, so we've heard through these three speakers an effort to create again some version of state mandate with respect to distribution of dense affordable development. We've heard some of the concerns about nuance related, and we've heard a strong opinion that relates to local control. At which point we can do nothing other than to turn to our distinguished professor of policy and planning, Mike Lansing. Mike, help us out, man. Work us through this.
So my task then is to kind of, bring everybody together, tie it all up in a bow.
Or just give us some insight.
Yeah, so, well, I mean, mea culpa, I mean, I was publicly supportive of SBA 27, so, it may not have been public to all of you because I'm just a guy with an opinion. So just to get that on the table, I agree very strongly with the sentiment behind as that bill, and for many of the reasons that Stuart and David brought up in terms of the extent of our affordability crisis, how it has reached I think larger and larger populations within our various communities. And also this idea of the tragedy of the commons, I think, as Senator Wiener said, local control is important but not biblical, if I'm paraphrasing there. And research I've done with Pablo Makinen shows that local control gets us, particularly of land use and of housing, gets us more segregated environments. Which I think Stuart captured this well with his discussion of exclusionary zoning and fiscal zoning. We see that out in the data specifically, right? That the more local control we have, the fewer state level safeguards that we have, the less regional planning that we have, and regional powers we have, the more segregation that we see. And there's that piece that is, I think, very important to me. I also I am extremely sympathetic to Cynthia's thoughtful comments and the people that she works with and works around on a daily basis, and their concern for seeing yet another cycle of development coming through their neighborhoods that could potentially lead to rapid change that they can't keep up with, right? So disadvantaged communities and low-income households are never well equipped to deal with change, particularly in housing markets. Because they already come to that market with very precarious, obviously, income situations. And so you do, I think, want to be, very, very attentive to those concerns. My understanding of where that bill evolved to is that the tenant protections and the inclusionary housing provisions that were in the bill were as strong as anything that has ever really gotten through Sacramento. I hope that, we are, the ship has sailed on SBA 27 this year, but I hope that we are arriving at a point in which people, which a coalition of people that are firmly behind SBA 27 in theory can get together and make something that ends up kind of serving at the very least the our need for more housing and protecting low-income communities. I can only imagine some of the pressures that Mayor Fuentes is under and has been under in serving a city like El Segundo that is also part of this the regional pressures, right, that are subject to the regional pressures of our extremely hot housing market. But I get concerned when people talk about their communities being built out. There are a lot of ways that we can find creative ways of constructing housing that we've been doing for a very long time. Building higher rather than building out farther. And when I hear built out, sometimes I worry that people are just kind of pulling up the ladder behind them and saying no more folks in my community. I don't want to, ascribe those intentions to the mayor, but, I don't know how much research that we have that says that, well, we can't retrofit a city's infrastructure for more people, or we can't find ways to accommodate more people through multifamily construction that is not going to overly tax infrastructure and things like that. So I am quite certain that I did not solve the problem of disparate opinions on this panel, but those are my thoughts and my kind of the ways that I pull some of these pieces together.
Thank you. Thank you very much. David, you're kind of lonely. You're,
Okay. Well, I've spoken enough.
would you like to bring together some of this? And
I got two things. One for Scott. The problem, I like your bill, and I think it goes part of the way. But the problem with your bill, and the problem is to build high-rise multifamily,
It's not hard.
or even mid-rise, mid-rise multifamily thing is, you're talking steel frame construction, it's going to cost, if it's a true high-rise building, it's going to cost $700,000 a unit. If it's a mid-rise building, it's going to come in at $450,000 to $500,000 a unit. That's out of the price range. And then if you're going to have like 20%, 15, 20, whatever the number is inclusionary, it's not going to work because the cost per unit, market rate, really, we add to supply, the numbers aren't going to work because it's just too expensive given the land cost in San Francisco, major parts of San Diego, and Los Angeles. And so to me is what has to happen is you have to be willing to accept more development in suburban areas where you could build traditional single family or low-rise condominiums where you could bring on units for $300,000, $350,000 in that, and you just need some kind of hookup to some kind of deeper transit corridor or something like that. And you have to deal with impact fees in the suburban areas where it costs $50,000 to $75,000 a unit before you even file the permit. So the developer's out $50,000, $75,000 just to file the building permit to pay the income, to pay the permit fees. So you have to find a way to have. I hate smart growth because that, I like dumb growth. I hate the term smart growth because it implies any other growth is dumb and stuff like that. But you have to find a way with some kind of transit linkage where you could offer for people a suburban alternative for them where you could deliver the housing. And that could be, in Riverside County, San Bernardino, the eastern parts of Los Angeles County. And even otherwise your area, people are commuting from Tracy into Silicon, as you well know, into Silicon Valley. You got to find a way to make that work, because if you're going to do dense infill, those are expensive. Those are very, very expensive units. And once you put 20% affordable into it, you mark up the value. You have to raise the price of the market rate units to make it work so the developer can make a return. So that's my concern, is you got to find a way to make this work in Riverside, make it work in San Bernardino in suburban locations. So what you have is good, but if you really want to think out, if it's a real affordability crisis, you got to think, doesn't have to be 1950 sprawl, but it has to be 2020 sprawl, if you know what I mean.
So, one of the challenges of doing housing work, especially if you do a more aggressive kind of bill, is there are so many problems with housing that we have to solve that everyone, everyone's, well, what about this problem? What about that problem? And these are all real problems, right? The cost of construction, for example. But it's not all going to be solved in one bill. It's going to take a lot of work over time. The bill is not, despite what some people said, and I've been a legislator for quite some period of time. Every bill that's controversial is going to be mischaracterized by some people. The level of misinformation that swirled around this bill was extraordinary to me. That this was eliminating all local control, which was absolutely false. It was in one area. It did override it, and that's significant in terms of density. But many, many aspects of local control were maintained intact, including local inclusionary, local demolition controls, and so forth. And then we put some tenant protections in, and we put some inclusionary requirements in, and we'll keep working on those, of course. That it was going to be high-rise, luxury high-rises everywhere. And the bill, especially as it evolved, it was 4- and 5-story buildings. In some areas, people view that as super high-rise, and I don't think that's. I think that would probably qualify as mid-rise. It's wood frame construction. I agree. Once you hit steel frame, one of the reasons we took the 8-story category out was that you're entering steel frame and it's more expensive. But the other area, it was really a fascinating dynamic because we had a lot of suburban areas coming forward and saying, oh my God, this is terrible, just focus everything on the cities. And then I had folks in my district and elsewhere saying, you're not doing enough to deal with the suburbs. The bill dealt with both, and that's one of the reasons why Marin County and Beverly Hills and Palo Alto and other higher income suburban areas, let me tell you, they were pretty intensely opposed to this bill because it did affect them. So the bill absolutely impacted suburban areas. I agree with you. It's not just about the big cities. It's not just about LA and San Francisco and so forth. It's about job centers, transit areas, and areas that are at least close to job centers. So I'm not advocating that everything needs to be packed into a few big cities. But we have to have it at least closer to where people are working. That's my view.
So there are many reasons to have particular points of view with respect to some of the nuance of Scott's proposed solutions here. But it should be no mistaking the fact that what he's brought forward, unlike almost everything else, is a proposal that has some scale to it. And because it has some scale to it, it has some salience to it, and is not, again, falling into this category of nice, fuzzy, warm, but otherwise symbolic, and otherwise not really useful at getting at the issues. Now, I'd like to throw one other item at our panel, and David alluded to this a little bit, and then of course we want to take time for your interests and direct conversation with the panel as well. And I'm going to, just for the sake of drama here a little bit, we're going to use Scott as the protagonist again. But Scott, here's a couple of questions for you, and then for everybody else to chime in. To what extent, up there in Sacramento, are your conversations about housing affordability spilling over into your conversations about funding of transportation infrastructure? That's the first question. If you could drill out the relationship between the two.
Yeah.
And the third is it, or second or third, depending on how you count, is the following. What is your anticipation of the way that autonomous vehicles, as are coming very hard and very fast into this world, going to affect the issues of affordable housing provision?
Sure. So it's an interesting dynamic in Sacramento. I was elected in 2016 on the same night as he who shall remain unnamed, which has made my experience up there a little different than what I anticipated. But until a few years ago, housing was not, I wouldn't call it a broad-based endeavor in the legislature. There were legislators who represented certain areas that were really impacted, certain parts of LA, Santa Monica, parts of the Bay Area, who were really working hard and passionate about housing. But there were many parts of the state where it was just, housing's always been expensive in most parts of California, but it was not at a crisis point yet. And over time, as this problem has spread across more and more parts of the state, I think you have more legislators who are focusing on it, who are really open to new approaches. The number of legislators from areas that are not traditionally super high cost areas who have made comments to me of colleagues who have said, my kids aren't going to be able to move back
Right.
into my community. And so we have more of a fertile ground to do good work in the legislature. Now, transportation, of course, is key to that. And I will say that even though we may not agree on everything, in California, we have really undermined our local community's ability to fund services. We've done it through our tax structure. With Prop 13, it's not just the public schools that suffered with Prop 13. Prop 13 is intensely anti-housing because it creates these very strong financial incentives to say if you build housing, you're going to lose money. If you build commercial, you're going to make more money. And so we have really harmed our local community's ability just to fund basic services. There is a lot of momentum in the legislature, which I'm hoping is not coming to a halt, to fund transformational transportation projects, public transportation and so forth. We passed the largest transportation funding measure in the history of California last year, SB1, which will provide enormous funding for local roads, for transit, and for the state highway system, which is falling apart. Unfortunately, a couple weeks, last week I guess, one of my colleagues got recalled in Orange County, Josh Newman. They went after him because he voted, it was a gas tax. And so they went after him, they took him out, he's a good man, and it's very sad to me that he paid that price. He did something very brave. That we now also have the same people that were behind that recall are now working, and they almost certainly will qualify a repeal of what we did, of that gas tax, which will eliminate $5.2 billion a year in transportation funding in the state of California. And then as part of their measure, it would ban us, legislature, from ever raising the gas tax again. So we are at a perilous time in California in terms of our ability to deal with the massive transportation needs that we have. And I agree, we have housing, transportation, it's two sides of the same coin, you have to do both. In terms of autonomous vehicles, I think it's great. I look forward to the day where we have much better traffic flow and it's all zero emission and all that. It's going to take us a while to get there. But I get nervous that sometimes people argue, well, we don't really need to invest in public transportation because that's like a relic of the past. It's all going to be autonomous vehicles. We don't need transit anymore. Don't invest all that money. That makes me nervous because we still have a geometry issue on our roads and our bridges in terms of congestion. And while autonomous vehicles might be more efficient than regular human beings because we're imperfect and we get distracted and we are not always the best drivers, it's not going to be enough. When you look at the number of people who get carried on transit, particularly in congested areas, we're always going to need it. So I think we need to move towards AVs, but also keep investing in transit.
Anyone else want to jump in? Thank you.
Well, I want to say a couple things. When you were talking about sprawl before, I might be the oldest person in the room, but growing up in Los Angeles, I remember going down to San Diego, and there was nothing in between when I was a kid except Orange County, just a little bit. And then it's all built out. And as an aerospace engineer and systems engineering, I hear a lot of things. I hear transportation, I hear housing. What I'm not hearing is some sort of incentivizing of employment centers, encouraging businesses to build other places where affordable housing can be built. And some of that will be single family. There is nothing wrong with that. And I just want to say, as far as SB1, personally, I was thrilled that Josh Newman was recalled, and I will support a recall of that because that was passed by a supermajority in our legislature. That tax was not sent to the voters to approve. The legislature did that. And just in California, we had Measure M, a year or two ago, which was a forever tax with a 40-year plan for transportation. So I would like to see employers, again, encouraged and incentivized to build other places in the state where there can be affordable housing with good qualities of life.
Where does that exist? Where are these places?
Well, if you drive from my house to Scott's house, you'll see a lot of property that can be built or developed. So
So like, jobs are a problem? Like you want to export jobs somewhere else?
I'm saying yes, I mean, to set up centers where people can work and live. I mean, everything doesn't have to be concentrated in certain areas. San Francisco, Los Angeles, San Diego.
Well, it just seems like you're picking new areas of concentration.
Yeah.
But, and I don't know why the new area is any better than building on existing areas that we have. Where we have infrastructure, where we have a proven demand for people to live there. And I mean, I don't know, I'm not a business owner, but I don't know how many folks want to locate into the Central Valley.
Well, they locate all over, and I know people move to California all the time, but I also see an exodus of people leaving the state or taking jobs in other states for a higher quality of life and less traffic, more space. So,
I mean, my reservation.
So, oh, please.
Go ahead.
I mean, my reservation for that would be that it sounds like the kind of thing that could lead to pretty pronounced segregation, economic and racial segregation. Because what we're seeing right now is the people who can't afford higher cost housing being the ones who are being pushed out of the cities. There's a lot of push out happening. And I think we really need to make some space in the cities for those folks. And that's going to mean building denser housing. And the cities will be very different, from the ones that we grew up in. And, my family's been here for 100 years. And I heard my grandmothers talk all the time about how great it was when they were kids, and the air smelled like orange blossoms and da-da-da. But, it doesn't smell like frickin' orange blossoms anymore, and it's never going to. So I can't, I can't tell one of my residents who has 2 kids, and mostly speaks Quiche and can't read or write, that she has to move out to some job center in Lancaster when all of her social support is right here.
I'm not even suggesting she does.
Well, but then say we move like this room instead out there with some sort of businessy thing that's happening out there, and then you're still getting that, and then we leave the residents that we have here. I mean, I think we have to build an intentionally integrated city, and that it's going to take like you said, you're getting shortchanged on the public investment, and that's fair, totally fair, and it will take some huge public investment, and I don't think the market's going to fix this. It's going to take a boatload of resources, and they're going to have to come from somewhere. But I would be very concerned about trying to export folks and out of the city.
So I thank you. We're very short on time. We only have a couple more minutes, and I do want to open it up. But I just want to emphasize that this conversation basically boils down to what is the vision? What is your vision for the California of your kids? What do you want the state to look like? And a vision of California with unaffordable housing up and down the coast is a vision of job and population migration elsewhere. And it is a vision of increasingly less economic activity along our coastline. And that is simply a natural consequence of spatial economics. And so just like we have a national debate about jobs going to Mexico and from Mexico to India and from India to Vietnam or whatever, similarly, jobs will flow right out of California in the consequence of lack of affordable housing. And in fact, that's happening. So again, what's your vision? We at UCLA, as the University of California, the public university of the state of California, are very proud to host this panel, this dialogue, and to hear these different points of view. Thank you.